Welcome to our channel. Today's story is about second chances, change, and the courage to face your past. Mark Stevens, a seasoned cop, finds his world turned upside down after a single mistake, wrongfully arresting Sarah Johnson, the head of the Community Relations Board. Suspended and forced to confront his own prejudices, Mark begins an unexpected journey alongside the very people he once dismissed. As he and Sarah work together, tensions flare, old friendships are tested, and Mark must decide whether he can become the man he never thought he could be. Can he truly change, or will he fall back into old habits? If you love stories about redemption and hope, hit the like button, subscribe, and comment below. Do you think people can change? Let us know where you're watching from, and don't miss out on this gripping story. Mark Stevens has been a cop for over 20 years, and it shows in the lines on his face, the way he walks with a slight limp, and the weary edge to his voice. He cruises through Brookwood's tree-lined streets in his police SUV, his hands gripping the wheel with the confidence of someone who knows every inch of this town. Brookwood is a place of manicured lawns, luxury cars parked on cobblestone driveways, and high-end shops that line the town square. Today, the streets are busy with families shopping for the upcoming holiday season. The crisp October air carries the scent of freshly baked pies from the local bakery, and the vibrant red and orange leaves swirl in the wind. As he drives, Mark surveys the scene outside with a mixture of boredom and resentment. To him, Brookwood is a facade, a polished surface hiding rot underneath. He watches a group of teenagers exiting a high-end electronics store, their arms full of shopping bags. They laugh loudly, jostling each other, oblivious to his gaze. "Look at them," he mutters, glancing at his reflection in the rearview mirror, where his own scowl stares back at him. Mommy and Daddy's money, no sense of responsibility. He feels a familiar surge of bitterness, remembering his own teenage years spent working part-time at a dingy hardware store across town. For these kids, life is all about new gadgets and expensive sneakers. For him, it was about survival. Flashback to Mark's upbringing. Mark's mind drifts back to his childhood in Westwood, a stark contrast to the affluence of Brookwood. He remembers the shabby apartment building where he grew up, the leaky roof that left puddles on the kitchen floor every time it rained. His mother, June Stevens, worked 2 jobs, waitressing during the day and cleaning offices at night, just to keep food on the table. Mark would come home from school to find her exhausted, her hands cracked from scrubbing floors and washing dishes. There were nights when he would hear her muffled sobs through the thin walls as she tried to keep up with the bills. His father, a factory worker, had died when Mark was 12, leaving behind a stack of debts and a grieving family. Mark learned early that the world wasn't fair, that people like them had to scrape and fight for every scrap. He made a promise to himself that he'd never end up like his father, crushed under the weight of a life he couldn't control. That promise shaped him into the man. He became a man who sees the world as a place divided between those who keep order and those who threaten it. Mark's view of the town. Mark's patrol takes him past a pristine park where families gather around playgrounds and joggers run laps on the paved paths. He spots a young couple pushing a stroller, their laughter blending with the sound of children's playful shrieks. He grimaces, turning away. To him, it's just another reminder of what he never had. He pulls into a coffee shop to grab his usual, black, no sugar, and watches the patrons inside through the glass. A businessman in a tailored suit taps away on a laptop, while a young woman in yoga pants scrolls through her phone, sipping a latte. Mark's lips curl into a sneer as he takes in the scene. They don't know what real life is, he thinks, gripping his coffee cup tightly. Never had to worry about paying rent. Never had to sleep in a freezing apartment because you couldn't afford the heating bill. He knows he's not being fair, but the resentment has become like an old friend, a constant presence that he doesn't know how to let go of. Encounter with a homeless veteran. As he continues his patrol, Mark notices a figure huddled on a bench outside a high-end clothing store. A man with a shaggy beard, wearing a thin jacket despite the chill in the air. The man holds a sign that reads, "Veteran, hungry, anything helps." Mark slows down, watching as passers-by ignore the man, giving him a wide berth. A few people glance at him with pity before hastening away, clutching their shopping bags. Mark feels a familiar frustration bubbling up inside him. He doesn't belong here, he mutters, jaw clenched. He radios into dispatch. Got a vagrant outside Mercer and Pine. Going to check it out. Mark steps out of his SUV, the cold air biting at his face. He approaches the man, towering over him. Hey, you can't be here, he says, his voice carrying an edge of authority. There's a shelter on Elm Street. Go there if you need help. The man looks up, his eyes bloodshot and hollow. The shelter's full, officer, he mumbles, just trying to get enough for a warm meal. Mark feels a brief pang of sympathy, but he pushes it down, reminding himself of the countless times he's seen people take advantage of others' kindness. Not my problem, he says gruffly. Move along or I'll have to take you in. The man sighs and shuffles away, his shoulders hunched against the wind. As Mark watches him go, he tells himself that he's maintaining order, but a small part of him feels uneasy. He shakes it off, returning to his patrol car, but the image of the man lingers in his mind. It's late afternoon when the call crackles through Mark's radio. Unit 42, we've got a report of a suspicious individual outside Diamond & Company. Jewelry at Brookwood Mall. Possible shoplifting in progress. Mark's lips twist into a smirk as he flicks on his sirens. Here we go, he mutters, feeling a spark of satisfaction. He accelerates through the rain-slicked streets, his SUV's lights flashing against the gray sky. In his mind, he's already made up who the culprit is. Another young punk looking for a quick score, or maybe a desperate addict trying to steal for a fix. As he pulls into the mall's parking lot, he mentally prepares himself, imagining how he'll recount the arrest to his fellow officers later, how he'll remind them all that no one, not even the rich and privileged, can slip through the cracks under his watch. Encounter with Sarah. Mark steps out of the SUV, the rain soaking through his uniform almost immediately. He scans the area, looking for a shifty teenager or a twitchy addict, but instead his gaze lands on an elderly black woman standing quietly under the awning of Diamond & Company. She clutches a worn leather handbag to her chest, her gray hair tucked neatly under a clear rain bonnet. Mark feels a flash of irritation. What's she doing here, he thinks. Doesn't fit this place at all. He strides toward her, his hand resting instinctively on his belt. Ma'am, he says sharply, his voice cutting through the rain. I'm going to need you to step away from the store. We've had reports of suspicious activity. The woman turns to face him, her eyes widening in confusion. Her hands tremble slightly as she clutches her handbag. I'm sorry, officer, she says, her voice soft. I didn't mean to cause any trouble. I'm just waiting for my friend to pick me up. Mark narrows his eyes, suspicion clouding his judgment. Waiting outside a jewelry store in the rain? That's a little convenient, don't you think? How about you open that bag for me, ma'am? Sarah's face stiffens, but she meets his gaze with a calm defiance. I don't think I need to do that, officer. I'm not loitering. I'm not doing anything wrong. Mark feels a surge of frustration. He's used to people backing down when he flexes his authority. He steps closer, towering over her, his tone turning cold. You don't get to decide that. Open the bag or I'll have to bring you in. By now, a small crowd has gathered under the awning, their faces tight with concern. A few people take out their phones, recording the confrontation. Sarah's expression remains calm, though her hands tremble as she holds her bag tighter. Officer, please, I'm not a threat. I'm just an old woman waiting for a ride. The arrest Mark's patience snaps. He grabs Sarah's arm, twisting it behind her back as he reaches for his handcuffs. You're under arrest for loitering and failing to comply with an officer's orders, he snaps. Sarah winces as the cold metal cuffs click into place, but she keeps her head held high. The crowd murmurs in shock, some calling out for Mark to let her go, but he ignores them. He pushes Sarah forward, guiding her roughly toward his SUV. As he opens the door to the back seat, Sarah turns her head to look at him, her expression sad but steady. One day you'll understand that what you're doing isn't right, she says quietly. Mark feels a twinge of doubt at her words, but he quickly shoves it aside. He slams the door shut, then turns to the crowd with a scowl. Show's over, folks. Move along. He climbs into the driver's seat, his jaw tight with anger, but Sarah's words echo in his mind. haunting him despite his attempts to brush them off. Mark marches into the Brookwood police station, guiding Sarah with a firm grip on her arm. He expects to feel a sense of satisfaction as he walks past the bustling precinct, where officers nod at him in acknowledgement. But today, the acknowledgement feels hollow, like a duty rather than a mark of respect. He sits Sarah down on a bench near the booking desk, her hands still cuffed, and tells her to stay put, with a roughness that makes his voice crack. Sarah complies without a word, her calm demeanor unsettling him. As he fills out the arrest paperwork, Officer Jimenez, a young rookie, peers over his shoulder. "What did she do, Stevens?" Mark grunts. "Caught her loitering outside a jewelry store. Gave me attitude." Jimenez shrugs. "Well, if she was causing trouble..." He trails off, clearly uncomfortable. Mark doesn't respond, too focused on his paperwork and the gnawing feeling in his chest. Captain Reed's office. Suddenly, Captain Reed bursts out of his office, his expression livid. "Stevens, my office, now." Mark flinches, glancing over at Sarah, who sits quietly with her head bowed. He feels a cold knot of anxiety form in his stomach as he follows Reed into the office, closing the door behind him. "Sir, I was just doing my job," Mark starts, but Reed cuts him off with a glare. "That woman you arrested?" Reed's voice is tight with barely suppressed rage. "She's Sarah Johnson, the new head of the Community Relations Board. She's in charge of monitoring police conduct for the entire city." Mark's mouth falls open, the blood draining from his face. She's what?" Reed's face darkens with fury. "You didn't even bother to find out who she was before you slapped cuffs on her, did you? You saw an elderly black woman and assumed the worst." Mark feels the ground shift beneath him. He grasps for words but finds none. He realizes too late that his assumptions have put his career and the department's reputation in jeopardy. Sarah's composure and Mark's shame Reed's anger doesn't stop. "She has the power to recommend disciplinary actions against us, Stevens. You just handcuffed the woman who's been trying to help us improve relations with the community." Mark's legs feel like lead. He stumbles out of the office, his mind spinning, his throat tight with panic. He looks at Sarah, who meets his gaze with a mixture of sadness and pity, but no triumph. As he unlocks the cuffs with shaking hands, she speaks softly. "You've made mistakes, Officer Stevens, but you can choose to learn from them." Mark can't bring himself to respond. He watches as Sarah walks out of the precinct, her head high despite the humiliation he's put her through. He knows that his life and his career have just changed irrevocably. And for the first time in years, he doesn't know what to do next. Mark Stevens finds himself on suspension, a temporary but brutal blow to his pride. The first few days, he tries to keep busy at home, tinkering with the broken dishwasher, going for long drives through the outskirts of town. But the silence is oppressive, and no matter how much he tries to drown out his thoughts, they keep coming back to the image of Sarah Johnson standing in the precinct, her wrists red from the handcuffs he had placed on her. As he sits on his porch one evening, sipping a cheap beer, his phone buzzes with messages from colleagues. Most of them are short, empty words of encouragement like, "Hang in there," or "These things blow over." But one message from his old partner, Joe, stands out. "This is what happens when you try to get cozy with those community types. They'll throw you under the bus." Mark puts down his phone, feeling a surge of resentment, but he can't shake the nagging doubt that maybe, just maybe, he did this to himself. His pride won't let him admit it fully, but the seeds of self-reflection are planted, however unwillingly. The first diversity training session. Mark's suspension comes with conditions. He must attend a series of community training sessions, organized by Sarah Johnson's Community Relations Board. Mark approaches the first session with a simmering anger, feeling as though he's being paraded in front of people who want nothing more than to see him humiliated. He arrives at the Brookwood Community Center, a modest brick building with flyers plastered on the front windows, announcing job fairs and neighborhood cleanups. Inside, the training room is small, with folding chairs arranged in a circle. Mark sees faces he recognizes: Jalen, the young black man he once stopped for speeding; Rebecca, a Latina waitress from the cafe he frequents; Linda Carter, the session's leader and a close ally of Sarah's. Linda is sharp-eyed, with silver hair pulled into a bun and a no-nonsense demeanor. She watches Mark with a look of cautious expectation, as if she's not sure whether he'll bolt out the door or stay. Mark takes a seat at the back, arms crossed, glancing around the room with a defiant expression. He feels eyes on him, a mix of curiosity and judgment. He tells himself that he doesn't care what these people think, but he knows he's lying to himself. Confronting prejudice. Linda starts the session with an exercise. Let's share a time when we felt misunderstood or judged because of who we are. Her voice is calm but firm, and she meets Mark's gaze directly as she speaks, as if daring him to listen. Mark rolls his eyes, dismissing the whole exercise as touchy-feely nonsense. But as people begin to share, he finds it harder to tune them out. Jalen talks about being pulled over for driving while black, the fear that churns in his gut whenever he sees police lights in his rearview mirror. Rebecca shares how customers at the cafe assume she doesn't speak English well, even though she was born and raised in Brookwood. Mark fidgets in his seat, trying to keep the defensiveness out of his expression. He's tempted to dismiss their stories as exaggerations, but something nags at him. How could they all be lying? When it's his turn, Linda fixes him with a direct look. Officer Stevens, care to share? Mark shrugs, feeling the eyes of the room on him. Look, sometimes people just misinterpret things, he says stiffly. Being a cop isn't easy. We have to make split-second decisions. You don't get time to worry about feelings. A tense silence follows his words, and Mark can see the skepticism in their faces. Linda speaks up, her tone measured but unyielding. Maybe it's not about misinterpretation, Officer Stevens. Maybe it's about seeing things from a perspective you haven't considered before. This training isn't about telling you what to think. It's about giving you the chance to listen. Mark wants to argue, to defend himself, but he can feel the weight of their eyes on him, the raw honesty in their stories, pressing against his own beliefs. He slumps back in his chair, arms crossed, staring at the floor. For the rest of the session, he doesn't speak. The following Saturday, Mark is required to attend a community cleanup event as part of his training. He arrives at Brookwood Park, where volunteers gather with trash bags and gloves, preparing to pick up litter and repaint benches. Mark feels like a fish out of water. These are the same people he once saw as outsiders, and now he's expected to work alongside them. Linda assigns Mark to work with David, a 17-year-old with bright eyes and a sharp sense of humor. David clearly remembers Mark from the times he patrolled their neighborhood, and there's a wariness in his gaze that stings more than Mark wants to admit. They start out in awkward silence, picking up trash near the park's playground, but David's natural curiosity eventually gets the better of him. So, Officer Stevens, Huerenoni, he says, tossing a crumpled soda can into a bag. What's it like being on the other side for a change? Mark forces a laugh, but it comes out strained. Not as different as you'd think, he replies. Just trying to keep things in order, that's all. David stops and looks at him, raising an eyebrow. Is that what you think you're doing? Keeping order? Mark feels a flash of defensiveness, but catches himself. He's supposed to be listening, isn't he? He shrugs, trying to keep his voice neutral. Maybe I don't know what it's like on your side, but that's why I'm here, I guess. David studies him for a moment, then nods slowly, as if deciding to give him the benefit of the doubt. They work together in relative silence after that, but there's a sense of truce between them. Witnessing Sarah's impact. During a break, Mark finds himself lingering near a picnic table where Linda and Sarah are talking. He tries not to eavesdrop, but their conversation draws him in. Linda talks about Sarah's work with local youth, how she set up mentorship programs and scholarships for kids who would otherwise fall through the cracks. I've seen how much she cares, Linda says, her voice softening. She doesn't just fight for justice. She tries to give people hope. Sarah glances over and catches Mark's eye, offering a small nod. Mark looks away quickly, but he can't ignore the feeling that twists inside him. He's always thought of himself as doing the right thing, but he's never seen anyone look at him the way people look at Sarah, with admiration, with trust. For the first time, he wonders if maybe he's missed something important. Climax of emotion. As the cleanup event wraps up, Mark watches as Sarah comforts an elderly woman who's struggling to carry a bag of canned food. The woman's gratitude is palpable, her voice trembling as she thanks Sarah for organizing a food drive that kept her from going hungry. Mark's throat tightens, and he can't shake the feeling that he's been seeing the world through a narrow lens for far too long. Back at the precinct, Mark finds Joe waiting for him in the parking lot. It's late, and the streetlights cast long shadows across the asphalt. Joe leans against his cruiser, arms crossed, his expression hard. "I hear you've been busy, Stevens," Joe says, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Playing community hero, huh?" Mark stiffens, bracing himself. "I'm just doing what they told me to do, Joe. It's not like I had a choice." Joe scoffs, shaking his head. "Come on, Mark. You really think these people care about us? They'll say all the right things to your face, but the second you mess up, they'll throw you to the wolves." He steps closer, lowering his voice. "You're one of us, Mark. Don't forget that. Don't let them make you soft." Mark's jaw tightens. A part of him wants to agree with Joe, to retreat into the familiar comfort of old loyalties. But another part of him, a smaller part, remembers the stories he heard in the training session, the gratitude he saw in the eyes of the people Sarah has helped. "I don't know, Joe," he says slowly, surprising himself with the uncertainty in his voice. "Maybe there's more to this than we realized." Joe's eyes narrow, his expression turning cold. "Yeah, well, just remember who has your back when things go south. These people, they don't care about you, Mark. Not like we do." He turns away, climbing into his car with a final glare. Mark watches him drive off, feeling a sense of loss that he can't quite name. He knows he's drifting away from the life he's always known, but he's not sure if the new path he's on is any better. Reckoning with the past. That night, Mark lies awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. He thinks back to the day he arrested Sarah, to the way she held her head high even as he led her into the station. He remembers his mother's voice on the nights when she would work late, telling him to always treat people with respect, no matter how hard life got. Mark rolls over, trying to push the memories away, but they keep coming back, like ghosts he can't banish. For the first time, he admits to himself that maybe, just maybe, he was wrong about Sarah. Wrong about the people he's been judging for so long. He gets out of bed, pacing the small space of his living room, feeling like he's standing on the edge of a precipice. He knows that if he steps forward, if he allows himself to see the world through a different lens, he might never be able to go back, and that thought terrifies him. Mark reluctantly agrees to attend a community basketball game at the Brookwood Community Center, where Sarah has been working to build connections between the town's youth and local law enforcement. The gymnasium echoes with the sound of bouncing basketballs and kids shouting encouragement from the sidelines. Mark stands near the entrance, feeling out of place as he watches Sarah move easily among the players, offering tips and high fives. He's surprised by how comfortable she seems, like she belongs in a way he never has. He tries to ignore the tightness in his chest as he watches her. She notices him standing by the door and walks over, offering a water bottle with a small smile. "You don't have to stay if you don't want to, Mark," she says, her voice kind but matter-of-fact. "But if you're here, I hope you'll watch with an open mind." Mark hesitates, then nods, taking the bottle. He finds a spot on the bleachers and sits down, feeling like he's back in school, waiting for a lecture. But as he watches the game, something shifts inside him. He sees the way the kids light up when Sarah praises their efforts, the way they look to her for guidance. It's not the kind of power he's used to, but it's real, and it's earned. Sarah shares her story. After the game, as the kids gather around for pizza, Sarah sits down beside Mark. They watch the kids together in companionable silence, the hum of their chatter filling the air. Then Sarah speaks, her voice low but steady. "You know, I used to be a lot like you, Mark. I used to think that life was just about surviving, about looking out for yourself." Mark glances at her, surprised. "Yeah, what changed?" Sarah's expression softens and she looks out at the kids. "My brother died when I was young. It was a car accident, caused by a drunk driver who happened to be a police officer. No one held him accountable. My family fell apart after that. But instead of turning my back on the system, I decided to try to change it, to make sure that no other family had to go through what we did. Mark feels a lump form in his throat, a deep ache that he can't quite place. He's never imagined that Sarah's fight for justice came from a place of such personal pain. For the first time, he sees her as more than an opponent, more than a symbol of everything he resents. Emotional climax. Mark doesn't know what to say, so he just sits beside her, feeling the weight of her story settle inside him. They sit in silence as the kids laugh and joke around them, a fragile truce forming between them. Mark realizes that he's not sure who he is anymore. But maybe that's not such a bad thing. Mark's suspension stretches on, leaving him in a limbo between the world he knew and the new one that remains stubbornly out of reach. He spends his mornings driving aimlessly through the empty streets of Brookwood, the autumn leaves turning from gold to brown, scattered across the roads. He no longer finds solace in the routine patrols he used to cherish. The radio in his car stays silent. He's not allowed to use it during suspension, a fact that gnaws at him with every turn of the wheel. Mark's phone buzzes occasionally with messages from his old partner, Joe. The messages have shifted from camaraderie to thinly veiled disdain, calling him a sellout for continuing to engage with the community even after his suspension. Joe's words sting more than he'd like to admit. Mark has always considered himself loyal to the force, a protector of the town. But now he's not sure what he's protecting anymore. Sarah reaches out. One gray afternoon, while Mark sits on his porch nursing a cup of black coffee, his phone buzzes with a new message. It's from a number he doesn't recognize. When he opens it, he finds a text from Sarah Johnson. "I'd like to talk if you're willing. Meet me at the community center this evening. I have a proposal for you." Mark stares at the message for a long moment, his thumb hovering over the screen. He considers ignoring it, but curiosity, and perhaps a small, fragile hope, pulls him in. He types back a short reply. "I'll be there." The proposal that evening. Mark arrives at the Brookwood Community Center. The building is quiet. Most of the evening program's already finished. He finds Sarah in a small meeting room at the back, surrounded by charts and flyers. She's scribbling notes on a whiteboard when he walks in. "Officer Stevens," she says with a smile, using his title with a hint of warmth that surprises him. "Thank you for coming." Mark shifts awkwardly, glancing at the flyers pinned to the walls. Workshops on job training, community events, programs for at-risk youth. It's a world he's never truly been a part of, and he feels like an intruder. Sarah gestures to a chair. "Sit, please. I want to talk to you about something important." Mark takes a seat, folding his hands in his lap. "What is this about, Sarah?" She leans against the edge of the table, meeting his gaze. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened between us, about how things went wrong, but I don't believe in giving up on people. I believe in second chances, and I think this town needs to see us working together." Mark frowns, unsure where this is going. "You think the town wants me around? You think they'll ever trust me after what I did?" Sarah nods slowly. "That's the thing, Mark. Trust isn't given freely, it's earned, one step at a time. I want you to join me in leading a new initiative, a town hall series where community members and officers can come together, share their experiences, and work towards real change." Mark feels his pulse quicken. A part of him wants to dismiss the idea, to walk out the door and leave this world behind. But another part, the part that has been growing ever since he heard those stories in the diversity training sessions, won't let him. "You really think I can help?" he asks, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah's expression softens. "I think you have more to offer than you realize, Mark, and I think you need this just as much as the town does." After a long pause, Mark takes a deep breath and nods. "All right, Sarah, I'll do it." The first town hall meeting is scheduled for a Saturday evening at the Brookwood Community Center. Mark spends the hours leading up to it in a state of nervous energy, pacing his small apartment, rehearsing what he might say. He knows the faces he'll see in that room, faces of people he has patrolled for years, but never truly listened to. He feels like he's walking into enemy territory, even though he's supposed to be one of them. When he arrives at the community center, the meeting room is already filling up. Linda stands near the entrance, offering greetings and passing out pamphlets with Sarah. Mark forces a smile. but he can see the flicker of doubt in her eyes. He wonders if she's still waiting for him to give up and walk away. Sarah calls the meeting to order, introducing herself and Mark as co-facilitators. Her voice is calm and confident, but Mark's hands tremble as he grips the edge of the podium. He feels the weight of every gaze in the room, residents who see him as the enemy, and officers who think he's betraying them. "I know I've made mistakes," Mark begins, his voice rough with nerves. "But I'm here because I want to do better. And I want to hear from all of you. What you need, what you expect from us as officers." The silence that follows is crushing, and Mark can feel his confidence faltering. Then Jalen stands up in the back row, his arms crossed, his expression hard. "We've heard those promises before, Officer Stevens. What makes this any different?" Confronting skepticism. The room buzzes with murmurs of agreement, and Mark feels a wave of defensiveness rising inside him. He glances at Sarah, who gives him a steady look, a reminder to listen, not react. He takes a deep breath, forcing down the urge to lash out. "You're right, Jalen," he says slowly. "I don't expect you to trust me right away, but I'm here because I want to earn that trust, even if it takes time." Jalen narrows his eyes, clearly unconvinced, but Sarah steps in to redirect the conversation. "This is about dialogue, not just promises. Let's share our experiences and see if we can find some common ground." Several residents speak up, recounting their negative experiences with law enforcement, being followed in stores, being pulled over for minor infractions, feeling constantly watched. Mark listens, his hands clenching tighter with every story. He's heard these complaints before, but never like this, never so raw and direct. He forces himself to stay silent, to absorb their anger without dismissing it. A moment of doubt. At the end of the meeting, as people begin to filter out, Mark lingers near the door, feeling a deep sense of failure. He catches bits of conversation, whispers about whether he's just playing a role, about whether this initiative will make any difference. Sarah joins him, her expression weary but hopeful. "You did well tonight, Mark. You listened, and that's more than most people in your position would do." Mark shakes his head, staring at the floor. "They still hate me, Sarah. They still see me as the enemy." Sarah places a hand on his arm, offering a gentle squeeze. "Change takes time. You can't expect to undo years of mistrust in one meeting. Keep showing up. That's how you'll prove yourself." Mark looks at her, searching for the hope that seems to come so easily to her. He nods slowly, but inside, he's still filled with doubt. He wonders if he's fooling himself, if he's capable of becoming someone new. 2 weeks after the town hall meeting, tensions in the neighboring town of Riverton boil over. A local incident involving a police officer and a black teenager has sparked protests, and residents from Brookwood and Riverton gather outside the courthouse, demanding justice. Mark finds himself called in to assist with crowd control. As he arrives on the scene, he notices that the atmosphere is charged with emotion, anger, grief, frustration. Protesters hold signs that read, "Justice for all, and we deserve to be heard." Mark scans the crowd, catching sight of Sarah standing at the edge, her expression calm but determined. His radio crackles with orders from the commanding officer. "Stevens, we need you up front." Things are getting tense. Be ready to disperse the crowd if necessary. Mark's heart pounds as he joins the line of officers. He spots Joe nearby, his face set in a grim expression. "Let's show them we're not backing down," Joe mutters, gripping his baton tightly. Mark's gut twists. He knows this could turn violent, and he's caught between his duty and a newfound desire to see things differently. As he watches the protesters chant, he realizes he doesn't see a faceless mob anymore. He sees Jalen, Linda, David, and the others he's met in the past weeks. Mark's stand. When the crowd surges forward, Joe steps toward them, raising his baton. Mark moves quickly, placing himself between Joe and the protesters, his hands held up in a gesture of peace. "Joe, stop! We don't need to escalate this. Let me talk to them." Joe glares at him, disbelief and anger written across his face. "You're going soft, Stevens. You think these people care about talking?" But Mark doesn't back down. He turns toward the crowd, raising his voice. "Please listen to me. Let's keep this peaceful. We don't want anyone to get hurt here. Emotional climax. The protesters hesitate, their shouts dying down as they see Mark standing with his hands up, facing both the officers and the crowd. Sarah steps forward, meeting Mark's gaze with a small nod of approval. Together, they manage to de-escalate the situation, convincing both sides to lower their voices and back away from a confrontation. The tension finally eases, and Mark feels a sense of relief wash over him. But when he looks back at Joe, he sees only disappointment in his eyes. Joe's ultimatum. After the crowd disperses, Joe corners Mark by his patrol car. His voice is tight with barely controlled rage. "I don't recognize you anymore, Mark. You've changed, and not for the better. Don't expect me to back you up next time." Mark watches Joe walk away, feeling like he's lost a part of his past. But as he glances over at Sarah, who is comforting a distraught woman from the crowd, he knows he's gained something else. He's not sure yet what it is, but it feels important, like the first crack of light breaking through a long-closed window. In the weeks that follow, Mark and Sarah work together closely, planning the next town hall meeting and organizing a youth mentorship program. Sarah teaches Mark how to listen more deeply, how to ask questions without assuming he already knows the answers. It's harder than he expected, but it feels good, like he's finally learning something real, something that matters. Mark begins to see the changes in himself, small but steady. He finds himself genuinely interested in the stories of the people he once dismissed. He starts to understand why Sarah has fought so hard for this community and why she never gave up on him, even when he made it difficult. An unexpected apology. One evening, as they're cleaning up after a planning session at the community center, Mark turns to Sarah, his expression uncharacteristically vulnerable. "I owe you an apology, Sarah, for the way I treated you, for the things I said. I thought I was doing my job, but I realize now that I was just holding on to my own fear." Sarah looks at him, her eyes softening. "You've already shown me you're sorry, Mark, but it means a lot to hear you say it." She pauses, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Just remember, change isn't about perfection. It's about making the effort, day by day." Climax of acceptance. Mark feels a weight lift from his shoulders, a sense of peace that he hasn't known in years. He realizes that this is what he's been searching for. Not approval, not power, but the chance to be part of something bigger than himself. Mark Stevens' suspension is officially lifted, and he is reinstated to active duty. But his return to the precinct feels different this time, like he's stepping into a new chapter of his life. His uniform, which once symbolized authority and control, now feels like a reminder of the responsibility he has to the people he serves. Mark continues working closely with Sarah, organizing town hall meetings and youth mentorship programs, but he also starts taking on a larger role in the police department's approach to community relations. He becomes the face of the department's effort to bridge the gap between law enforcement and Brookwood's residents, a role that makes some of his colleagues uneasy. Reaching out to Joe. One evening after a long day of meetings and paperwork, Mark finds himself dialing Joe's number. The call rings for a long time before Joe answers, his voice gruff and wary. "What do you want, Mark?" Joe asks. "I thought you'd gone full-time with your new friends at the community center." Mark takes a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "Look, Joe, I know you don't agree with what I'm doing, but I want you to understand why I'm doing it. It's not about turning my back on the force. It's about trying to do better for everyone." There's a long silence on the other end, and Mark can picture Joe sitting in his living room, scowling at the phone. Finally, Joe speaks, his tone edged with bitterness. "You think those people care about us, Mark? They don't know what it's like out here." Mark swallows hard, pushing back against his old instincts. "Maybe they don't know what it's like, Joe, but we don't know what it's like for them either. Maybe if we tried to understand each other, we wouldn't be in this mess." Joe's voice softens, just a fraction. "You've changed, Mark. I don't know if that's a good thing or not, but I'll think about it." Mark hangs up, feeling a flicker of hope. He knows he can't force Joe to change, but maybe, just maybe, he's planted a seed. Sarah's encouragement. The next day, Mark tells Sarah about the conversation as they prepare for the next town hall meeting. They sit together in the community center's small office, surrounded by stacks of flyers and pamphlets. Sarah smiles, her expression warm. You did the right thing, reaching out to him. Change is hard for everyone, Mark, but sometimes all it takes is one person willing to take the first step. Mark nods, feeling a swell of gratitude. You've been that person for me, Sarah. I don't know where I'd be without your patience. Sarah's smile widens, a hint of pride in her eyes. I'm proud of you, Mark. But remember, this is just the beginning. There's a lot more work to be done. Mark looks around the cluttered office, thinking about how far he's come and how far he still has to go. But for the first time, the thought of the journey ahead doesn't scare him. It excites him. The Brookwood Youth Mentorship Program kicks off with a workshop at the community center, and Mark is one of the main facilitators. It's a new experience for him, standing in front of a group of teenagers who look up at him with a mixture of curiosity, skepticism, and hope. David, the sharp-witted high school student Mark met during the cleanup event, is there, along with Jalen and several other kids from the neighborhood. Mark spends hours preparing for his session, writing and rewriting his speech, trying to find the right words to convey what he wants to say. He knows he's being given a second chance to connect with these kids, to show them that they have options, that they can make a difference. Mark shares his story. When the day of the workshop arrives, the community center's main room is packed with teenagers, some slouched in their seats, others sitting upright with eager expressions. Mark stands at the front of the room, feeling the weight of their expectations pressing down on him. He clears his throat, trying to keep his voice steady. When I was your age, I thought my life was already decided, he begins. I grew up on the wrong side of town, in a place where the only way to get by was to keep your head down and hope no one noticed you. He pauses, meeting their eyes. I became a cop because I thought it would give me control over my life. I thought it would protect me from the things I was afraid of. But it didn't make me stronger. It just made me angrier. The kids are listening now, leaning in, their expressions softening. Mark takes a deep breath, feeling a sense of vulnerability that he's never allowed himself before. It took me a long time to realize that strength isn't about how tough you are or how much power you have over others. It's about being willing to admit when you're wrong. It's about listening, even when it's hard. There's a long silence when he finishes, and for a moment he worries that he's lost them. But then David raises his hand, a small smile playing on his lips. So you're saying even old guys like you can learn new tricks? The room erupts into laughter, and Mark can't help but chuckle. The tension breaks and he feels a warmth spread through him, like a door has finally been opened, and he's being welcomed inside. Building new connections. After the session, several kids linger behind to ask Mark questions about becoming a police officer, about what it's like to be on the other side of the law. He finds himself answering honestly, sharing stories about his early years on the force, the mistakes he made, and the things he wishes he had done differently. David hangs back, waiting until the others have left before approaching Mark. You know, Officer Stevens, I didn't think you'd actually come around, but I guess I was wrong. Mark smiles, clapping David on the shoulder. I'm glad you gave me a chance, David. And hey, you don't have to call me officer all the time. Just Mark is fine. David grins. All right, Mark, I'll see you at the next session. As he watches David leave, Mark feels a sense of pride swelling in his chest. He knows that he's making a difference, even if it's just a small one. And for the first time in years, he feels like he's right where he's supposed to be. Not long after the success of the mentorship program, a crisis hits Brookwood's downtown area. A fire breaks out in a local apartment building, leaving several families displaced. Mark is called in to help manage the evacuation and coordinate with the fire department. When he arrives on the scene, the air is thick with smoke, and the street is filled with frightened residents. Mark spots Sarah among them, helping an elderly woman into the back of an ambulance. Sarah, he calls, rushing over to her. What can I do? She looks at him, her face streaked with soot, but her eyes clear and determined. We need to find shelter for these families tonight. Can you help coordinate with the local shelters? Mark nods, jumping into action. He finds himself working alongside Sarah and the other volunteers, making phone calls, gathering supplies, and reassuring families as they wait for news about their homes. It's chaotic and exhausting, but for the first time, Mark feels like he's part of something bigger than himself. A moment of reflection. As the sun rises, casting a pale light over the still smoking building, Mark stands beside Sarah, watching the firefighters finish their work. He's covered in ash, his muscles aching, but there's a sense of satisfaction in his chest that he hasn't felt in years. Sarah glances at him, a small smile tugging at her lips. "You did good tonight, Mark. The families will remember your help." Mark shakes his head, a bittersweet smile crossing his face. "I just did what needed to be done. It's not much." Sarah's expression turns serious. "It's more than you think, Mark. People notice when someone shows up, even when it's hard. That's how trust is built." Mark looks out at the families gathered on the sidewalk, some of them watching him with a new kind of respect. He realizes that Sarah is right. He's starting to earn back their trust, little by little. And for the first time, he believes that he might actually deserve it. As the crisis subsides, Sarah and Mark decide to organize a community festival to lift people's spirits and celebrate the progress they've made together. They reach out to local businesses, gathering donations for food and activities. Mark even convinces a few of his colleagues to volunteer, including Joe, who agrees reluctantly after a long talk over beers. On the day of the festival, the park is transformed into a hub of activity. Booths line the pathways filled with homemade crafts, local food vendors, and games for the kids. Music plays from a rented sound system, and the air is filled with the smell of grilled burgers and cotton candy. Mark spends the morning helping to set up tables, his uniform shirt rolled up in the sleeves, revealing the tattoo of a faded eagle on his forearm, a relic from his younger, angrier days. As he works, he catches snippets of conversation, people talking about how good it is to see the community coming together again. The festival's success. By afternoon, the park is packed with families, teenagers, and officers mingling together. Mark finds himself playing catch with a group of kids near the lake, laughing as they try to show off their skills. He glances over to see David teaching a younger boy how to properly throw a spiral, and his chest swells with pride. Sarah stands on a small stage in the center of the park, microphone in hand, thanking everyone for their hard work. She calls Mark up to the stage, surprising him. "I want to recognize Officer Stevens for all the work he's done to make this festival happen," she says, her voice ringing with sincerity. "He's shown us that change is possible, even when it's hard." Mark stands beside her, feeling the weight of the moment. He sees the faces of the people in the crowd, Linda, David, Jalen, and the families from the Mentorship program, all looking up at him with something close to acceptance. Emotional high point. A round of applause swells, and for the first time, Mark feels like he's truly part of this community. It's a feeling he never thought he'd have, and it fills him with a deep sense of belonging. After the festival ends, Mark finds Joe waiting by his car, a beer in hand. He offers it to Mark with a half smile. "You did good today, Stevens," Joe says, his tone grudging but sincere. "Guess I was wrong about you." Mark takes the beer, clinking the bottle against Joe's in a quiet toast. "I was wrong about a lot of things too, Joe, but I'm trying to do better." Joe nods, looking out over the empty park. "Maybe I should give it a try too. Got room for one more at the next town hall meeting?" Mark grins, feeling a surge of hope. "Yeah, Joe, I think we can find a spot for you." As the sun sets, Mark and Sarah walk through the park, watching the last of the volunteers pack up. The air is warm, and the sky is painted with the deep purples and oranges of twilight. "You've come a long way, Mark," Sarah says, her voice filled with pride. "But there's still more to do." Mark nods, feeling a sense of peace settle over him. "I know, but I'm ready for it, Sarah. I'm not going back to the way things were." She smiles, reaching out to shake his hand. "Welcome to the team, Mark." Mark takes her hand, a genuine smile spreading across his face. For the first time in his life, he feels like he's right where he's supposed to be, standing beside Sarah, ready to face whatever challenges come next, knowing that he's no longer alone. Months have passed since the community festival, and the town of Brookwood has settled into a tentative new rhythm. The mornings are crisp as autumn gives way to winter, the air carrying the scent of wood smoke and the promise of the first snowfall. Mark Stevens sits at his desk in the precinct, looking over notes for the next community police dialogue session. The desk that once held only paperwork and citations is now scattered with flyers for workshops, thank you notes from local kids, and a framed photograph of the summer festival. In the picture, Mark stands beside Sarah and David, all three of them smiling under the bright blue sky. The image captures a moment he never thought he would experience, a moment of unity, of feeling like he belongs to something meaningful. He picks up the photo, tracing a finger along its edge, and feels a swell of emotion rising in his chest. Making a difference. Mark's days are different now. He still wears his uniform, still patrols the streets of Brookwood, but the way he sees the town, and the way the town sees him, has changed. He finds himself stopping at the community center after his shift, chatting with Linda about the latest neighborhood project, or playing a quick game of basketball with the kids in the gym. He's become a familiar face, not just as a police officer, but as a mentor, a neighbor, a friend. One afternoon, he visits a local school to talk about his work with the Mentorship program. He stands in front of a classroom full of wide-eyed kids, sharing stories about the challenges and rewards of being a police officer. He sees the hope in their eyes, the belief that things can be different, and he knows he's finally doing something that matters. After the talk, a young girl tugs at his sleeve. "Officer Stevens, do you think I could be a police officer one day?" she asks, her voice small but hopeful. Mark crouches down to her level, smiling warmly. "I think you can be anything you want to be, as long as you care about people and work hard. And if you ever need any advice, you know where to find me." Sarah's parting words. One chilly evening, Mark and Sarah sit together on the community center's front steps, watching the sun set over Brookwood's main street. The sky is streaked with pinks and purples, casting long shadows over the quiet town. They've just finished a planning session for the next town hall meeting, and Mark feels the comfortable weight of a job well done. Sarah glances at him, her expression contemplative. "You know, Mark, when I first met you, I wasn't sure if you'd ever really change, but you proved me wrong." Mark chuckles, shaking his head. "I wasn't sure I'd change either, Sarah. But you didn't give up on me. I'm not sure I deserve that." Sarah's smile softens and she places a hand on his arm. "Everyone deserves a chance, Mark, even those who've made mistakes. What matters is what you do with that chance." They sit in silence for a while, the cool evening air settling around them. Mark thinks about the long road that brought him here, the anger, the mistakes, the painful moments of reckoning. He knows he still has a lot to learn, a lot of amends to make, but he also knows that he's no longer the man he used to be. An invitation. As they get up to leave, Sarah stops him with a thoughtful look. "We're starting a new program next month, something to help build bridges between the younger generation and law enforcement. I could use someone with your experience. What do you say?" Mark grins, feeling a warmth spread through his chest. "I'd be honored, Sarah. Let's do it." Final thoughts. That night, as Mark drives home through the quiet streets of Brookwood, he glances in the rearview mirror and catches a glimpse of his own reflection. For the first time in years, he doesn't shy away from it. He thinks about the boy he used to be, the angry young man who wore a badge as armor, the officer who let his prejudices cloud his judgment. He knows that he'll always carry those parts of himself, but they no longer define him. As he pulls into his driveway, he feels a sense of peace settle over him, like the end of a long, difficult journey. He knows that the path ahead will have challenges, that there will be days when old habits try to creep back in, but he also knows that he's not walking this road alone. He smiles, turning off the engine and stepping out into the crisp night air. Above him, the stars glitter like distant beacons, guiding him forward. And for the first time in a long time, Mark Stevens believes that he's exactly where he's meant to be. If you've been moved by Mark's journey and the story of hope, redemption, and community, please subscribe to our channel and join us for more stories that inspire, challenge, and uplift. Hit the like button and leave a comment below sharing your thoughts. We'd love to hear how this story touched you. And if you know someone who might benefit from hearing about second chances and the power of change, don't forget to share this video. Your support helps us bring more stories like this to life. Thank you for watching and stay tuned for more.